So today I'm going to be taking a look at another video from Prager University. This video is entitled, What's Wrong with the 1619 Project? And given that it's PragerU, you know there's going to be a lot of pausing, and there's going to be a lot of time I have to spend contextualizing misinformation. With that said, let's take a look at the video.
Have you heard of the 1619 Project?
I have.
It was published by the New York Times in August of 2019. It won the Pulitzer Prize for Commentary in 2020. Its thesis: the United States was founded in 1619 when the first slave was brought to North America.
I would actually argue that this is not the thesis of the 1619 Project. I believe that the actual thesis of the 1619 Project would be that chattel slavery marked the United States long before it had a name and identity, and that the ramifications of that chattel slavery have been felt throughout the U.S.'s history and into the present day. And by exploring that particular context of history, we can find a lot of new insight and understanding of the lived experiences of Black Americans. So I believe that is the larger context of the goal. There was some reference to the fact that 1619 was the year the country was founded in the original New York Times publications. That has since been removed. I don't know if that's them redacting that statement, but I do not believe that that statement in and of itself is enough to claim as a thesis. I believe that the chattel slavery explanation is a much better understanding of what they are trying to argue throughout the project.
Wait, that brings up some questions. What happened to 1776?
Nothing.
To July 4th? The Declaration of Independence? George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison?
What about those three? George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison were all slave owners who made all of their wealth, pretty much all their wealth, off of the backs of slaves. Slaves built the plantations, slaves sowed the fields, slaves did all the work. They got all the benefits and the money from that. So what about these three? They were able to go off and do their political stuff because they didn't have to worry about anything in terms of their finances because of the backs of Black Americans. That's just the reality of things.
According to the 1619 Project, the Founding Fathers pushed for all that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness stuff to protect their slave holdings. Independence from England, that was just a smokescreen. To them, everything that's wrong with America is tied to her original sin of slavery, from segregation to traffic jams.
Okay, well, segregation, I think, speaks for itself. The U.S. was responsible for segregation. The traffic jam reference that is being made here is a reference to one of the articles in the 1619 Project that talked about how highways and certain roads, but mostly interstate highways, were built specifically through Black neighborhoods in the South. And so when there is issues with poorly designed roads and structures, it was often to avoid hitting a white neighborhood in favor of going through a Black neighborhood. It also created segregation between different areas. It's not uncommon to see white neighborhoods and Black neighborhoods separated by a highway. And this kind of stuff happened throughout the country. It wasn't just like the South or anything. Robert Moses did stuff like this in New York City, and quite racist policies. Anything you can look at from Robert Moses, the stuff he did was absolutely atrocious in New York. So there is actually some evidence to show that there is something tied to that claim, though I think he is kind of making a straw man version of the argument here.
Yes, traffic jams. For the 1619 Project authors, racism is not a part of the American experience. It is the American experience. Is this true? Let's look at three of the project's major claims. 1. Preserving slavery was the real cause of the American Revolution. If you ask the founders why they no
That's kind of complicated.
longer wanted to be a British colony, they would have given you a long list of reasons. taxation without representation, conflicts over debts from the French and Indian War, and the Stamp Act would be just a few. Probably most important was the burning desire to be free, to chart their own destiny as a sovereign nation. Protecting slavery, slavery was not under threat from the British.
I have to stop him there. Slavery was technically under threat from the British. There had been the beginnings of a lot of abolitionist movements by this particular time in 1776 within the mainland of the United Kingdom. There's actually a court case, Somerset versus Stuart, which occurred in the English courts, where the ruling essentially said that slavery had never been authorized by statute within England and Wales, and Lord Mansfield found it to be unsupported within England by common law. Although he made no comment on the position in overseas territories of the British Empire, Lord Mansfield's judgment was deliberately expressed in narrow terms, and scholars and later judges have disagreed over precisely what legal precedent the case set. Some have suggested that the case forms a precedent merely for a narrow prohibition against an enslaved person being removed from England against his will. The legacy of that was that it did set off an abolition movement in the within England. And again, this was in 1772. And the 13 colonies in the United States, the Somerset case was reported in detail by American colonial press. In Massachusetts, several slaves filed freedom suits in 1773 and 1774 based on the Mansfield ruling. These were supported by the colony's general courts for the freedom of slaves, but vetoed by successive royal governors. As a result, some individuals in pro-slavery and anti-slavery colonies, for opposite reasons, desired a distinct break from English law in order to achieve their goals with regards to slavery. So, I think it's a little bit disingenuous to say that there was no ties to the British at that point. The British technically did not free slaves in their overseas colonies till much later. I believe like 57 or so years after the formation of the United States. But the beginnings of that conversation were starting to happen in 1772, at the very least. And given all that, the policy of the southern states, if you are seeing this, would be to respond with a certain level of antagonism, at the very least. And while it probably wasn't the only reason, or possibly even the primary reason for revolution, it was a potential factor for influencing certain Americans, or people who would become Americans, to make their decision to leave England. I also think that one other important thing to note is that the English had, after the French and Indian War, barred certain settlements to the west of the current colonies. And given that perspective, it is essentially, it is hard to dismiss the idea that racism did not play a role in the desire to overthrow England and to form their own nation. There was a great desire to take the native lands to the west and to move in and start the beginnings of what would become known as Manifest Destiny. And what went into that process? The expansion of the slavery system. Why? Because people in the South, having a number of kids, the firstborn would probably inherit the plantation, and the second and thirdborn might move off to the west into indigenous lands, and after slaughtering enough Native Americans and settling down on a plantation of their own with their few of their inherited slaves, they would continue the family practice. That's the legacy of Mississippi and Alabama. That's how that happens. So I do believe there is a case to be made that slavery had a role in the American Revolution.
In fact, Britain didn't free the slaves in its overseas colonies until 1833,
That is a true
57
statement.
years later, after the Declaration of Independence. Yes, the subject of slavery was hotly debated at the Constitutional Convention.
Hotly debated is an understatement. There are 84 clauses in the Constitution. Not the Bill of Rights, but just the main Constitution. 6 of those clauses have to do with slavery, including one that identifies a person person identified as property, so a slave, as 3/5 of a person for voting purposes, because the South wanted representation for all of the slaves that they owned and wanted them to be seen as people in that context, but didn't want them to be recognized as people so they could continue to own them. So they came up with the 3/5 compromise. We literally defined a human being as 3/5 of a person so that rich landowners could actually have more legal rights to votes than anybody else. Because that seems fair.
But that was after the war was won. 2. Slavery made America rich. Slavery made
It did.
some Americans rich, true enough. Eli Yale, for example, made a fortune in the slave trade. He donated money and land for the university that is named after him.
I find it so funny that they're mentioning Yale University's connection and ties to slavery. Mostly because it kind of feels like one of those gotcha moments, stick it to the libs in their universities and their education. They're actually the real connections to slavery, right? The first 12 presidents in the United States owned slaves. Countless senators and congresspeople had slaves. This is not, 1, it was not an uncommon practice. 2, people own them. Like, what is the argument being made about Yale here? What, that one person who created a liberal institution and higher education and all that's bad? No, that's just another straw man attack.
But the institution of slavery didn't make America rich.
Yes,
In
it
fact,
did.
the slave system badly slowed the economic development of half the country. As economist Thomas Sowell points,
Thomas Sowell does not believe that systemic racism exists. I believe we should be taking anything Thomas Sowell says with a grain of salt.
out, in 1860, just 1 year before the Civil War began, the South had only 1/6 as many factories as the North. Almost 90% of the country's skilled, well-paid laborers and professionals were based in the North. Banking, railroads, manufacturing, all were concentrated in the North. The South was an economic backwater. And the cost of abolishing slavery.
So I'm not even going to break down those statistics and question them. I'll accept all those statistics because they seem reasonable. You know what the issue with all that is? Where did Northern industrialization get its raw materials? Want to take a guess? Where do you think cotton was being taken from to make shirts? Where do you think tobacco smoked by early capitalists in the North got their tobacco? Maybe some of the rice that they ate, some of the other crops that they were consuming. It came from the agrarian South. The US was able to thrive because it had a vastly different set of economies going out at once. The slave system allowed for the production of raw materials that would be shipped up north into the factories. Most of the southern railroads were literally direct lines going up north, or the use of the Mississippi River at certain points. The entire goal was to get goods from the south into the factories in the north to produce new objects, clothing, cigars, whatever have you. So no, the U.S. economy would not have suddenly thrived if the South had turned industrial when it did. The slave plantation system made it extremely cheap and efficient for slave owners to produce raw materials at enough of a profit so that they were able to sell their goods to the North and maintain that level of economy. Because raw materials were probably going to drop in price as industrialization went up. So slavery had everything to do with this and made the U.S. extremely profitable.
It was enormous, not merely in terms of dollars. Lincoln borrowed billions to pay for it.
So Lincoln borrowing money, I don't know what he's referring to, but I can only imagine that it's one of two things. One is the war costs, which I will deal with momentarily. But the second one is that when Washington, D.C. had its form of slavery abolished, every single freed slave, the former slave owner was paid $300 of federal money. There was reparations for slave owners. Did the slaves get any of that money? No. So now you have an entire class of people from D.C. who made $300 off of every slave, not to mention all the labor they stole from those slaves that are now freed for their entire lives. And what do the slaves get to do? Probably sharecrop. Education options were probably limited. So yeah, it was a win-win for the slave owners. They got paid. They got to pretty much keep their slaves for literal pennies off of what they just got back. And they just could turn them into sharecroppers. That doesn't really fix the problem, does it? That's not really the cost of abolishing slavery. Again, that's reparations for slave owners.
But also in terms of human life, 360,000 Union soldiers died in order to free 4 million slaves. That works out to about 1 soldier in blue for every 10 slaves freed. It's hard to look at that butcher's bill and conclude that the nation turned a profit from slavery.
So I'm going to come at this from this particular perspective. Every single one of those people who died was probably poor. The system that the North had is that people who were wealthy could buy another person's into the draft. You could literally dodge the draft by paying someone else to go for you. Given that, the overwhelming death of those 360,000 Northern soldiers is a tragedy. That's not even counting the wounded, the everything else. But what comes off as disingenuous to me in this particular context is we're sitting here talking about the 1619 Project, and we are talking about 360,000 lives that were probably majority white. And we're not talking about, and we didn't even discuss any of the people who died on the journey over. We're not talking about any of the people who suffered immensely or died on the plantations from heat stroke. We're not talking about any of those details. We're not talking about the lynchings that went on throughout the 19th and 20th century after the Civil War. We're sitting here and focusing on 360,000 primarily white lives. And again, the fact that all those people died in probably bloody and brutal ways is horrible. But I feel like it steals the frame and it brings it back to a narrative that's consistently talked about in textbooks, as opposed to the ones that are usually given a sentence. I just think that comes off as extremely disingenuous, even by PragerU standards.
And many things have happened since 1865. In the almost 200 years since the Civil War, the population of the country has grown almost 900%, and our national GDP has increased 12,000%.
The argument here being that because of, everything after the Civil War, that the GDP and the population going up is the true wealth of the country. Except the population going up had a lot to do with immigration. It had to do with expanding farming practices. It had to do with easier access to food and resources. It had to do with the Industrial Revolution and its corresponding agrarian revolution with, new fossil fertilizers and everything else that we've come to understand over the past 150 to 60 years. So that explains the population growth. The GDP growth is actually a lot more complicated, but after the end of slavery, there were two major pathways that most African Americans dealt with their lived experience. They either stayed sharecropping and stayed in the South, and maybe eventually were able to, if they were lucky, get a plot of land and maybe a decent home. But a lot of them also took the Great Migration north. And the capitalists in the North used the racial distinction between African Americans and white European immigrants to end up stopping a lot of unions and potential forays into socialism and communism. The understanding is that you could pit the groups against each other to drive costs down and pay workers less. So yes, even still after the Civil War, African Americans were being used and exploited both in the North and the South to help that GDP grow.
Slavery did not make America rich. 3. Racism is an unchangeable part of America.
So the entire claim he's going to make here is just going to be this wild tangent where he takes this thing and takes it in the most literal way possible. That it is unchangeable for America to ever, racism is just this permanent part of the country. That's not what I believe is meant by that claim. And I also could not find that claim directly in the 1619 Project. That said, taking it at that value, the way I would understand that and interpret it from any sort of scholarly understanding is that because racism is the root of all of the forms that we've talked about, like the chattel slavery, through the Civil War, into all the different forms of exploitation, and continues to today, the thesis I mentioned before. There is no way to remove the roots of racism from the lived experiences of people today. It is unchangeable in the fact that the history cannot be changed. When we look at a current lived experience, as long as there is income inequality, as long as there is not a genuine removal of racism from the country, which seems kind of hard to fathom on some level, then that will always be the legacy in history and story. Even if we removed racism, that is still the story of America's past. That is what's unchanging.
This argument is more philosophical than scholarly.
Philosophy is scholarly. I don't know what that phrase means. It's more philosophical than scholarly. That phrase means absolutely nothing. Conservatives are the ones who are always like, but the Greeks and philosophy, and it improved the West. Philosophy is literally scholarly by any definition. I literally don't know what he was saying right there.
But it undergirds the entire 1619 Project. It's also pernicious because it suggests that the United States is an inherently racist country that can't overcome its flaws.
I would argue that it is inherently racist in the fact that, as we said from the thesis part, the system was in place from the inception of the nation, even before the inception of the nation. So it was rooted in there. People made their wealth, their status, their everything off of this system, even before the country had formed. That we can't overcome its flaws, I don't think that's what it's arguing again. I think it's more speaking to the fact that we can never remove ourselves from the story of racism. Racism will always speak to the inequalities of today's life.
Yet that's exactly what it's done.
No.
Today, America is the most successful multiracial country in history. The only white majority country to elect a black president twice.
Is it bad that that statistic kind of makes me feel like the world's a lot more racist and kind of goes against his argument. Um, but that said, Barack Obama being a mixed race president, which people voted for him? Because as far as I remember, it was not white men. And actually, a lot of white women voted against him too. So he got in based on a lot of people of color coming out and voting for him, and just enough white people, reaching the point of finally being able to overcome the idea that a person with dark skin could actually run the country. I don't know if that's a win. I don't know if any of this really sounds like a win.
Of course, progress has not always been smooth. There have been terrible setbacks. But to compare American attitudes about race today to America 100 years ago, let alone to 1619, is absurd.
I think it's very important to make the connection between 1619, 1920, and 2020, and how racism has evolved, changed, and looked different. Nobody is comparing this to say the racism in 1619 with chattel slavery is identical to what's going on today. What they're saying is that the systemic issues from 1619 stem throughout the history of the United States and affect 2020. And I think that particular aspect of comparison is perfectly valid. And I also love how they're just like, in 2020, race is everything good. Everything is fine. Racism is, it's in the green. It's good. Everything is fine. Which is why we had BLM and the George Floyd protests, right? That's why all that had to happen.
Here's a fact that should be better known. 2 million black Africans have come to America as legal immigrants from countries like Nigeria in the last 50 years and have become one of the most successful groups in the country. Why would these folks move to what is often called an evil, racist country?
So here's the thing. Again, he uses the word legal immigration. And whenever that's said, and it's being said from a very conservative perspective, typically what's being referred to is the fact that people who have some form of status and wealth and capital in their their country of origin can move to the United States. People moving to the United States from Africa and majority of Asia are generally speaking not going to be people that do not already have money unless they are seeking refugee status. So the people coming here had money. So yes, even though the US is racist, and yes, even though those 2 million people will be subject to all of the evils of racism during that time that they are here, there is an understanding that they are probably coming here with more economic status and wealth than the average African American who's descending straight from chattel slavery. So I think this is a false equivalency and kind of a way to shift the conversation in a direction that is actually kind of ignoring the larger problem. And again, actually kind of backs the thesis of the 1619 project.
Because unlike many people lucky enough to be born here, they know that America is a land of opportunity for everyone.
Here we go. In the United States, there's no pretend of equality of opportunity. The right likes to talk about how this is the land of opportunity, how everybody has the chance to be great and everything. There is no equality of opportunity. There is no way to argue that the descendants of Thomas Jefferson who are white are going to have the same lived experience as the descendants of Thomas Jefferson who are black. And yes, they there's no reason to assume that when wealth is passed down from white family to white family to white family historically, that the people of color who were often slaves or being undermined in any way to get any sort of resources would not be in some sort of disadvantage to each other. And in 2020, there is still no access to equal opportunity. When people in socialism talk about what they're looking for, it's not some equality of outcome, it's equality of opportunity. We all want to be starting relatively from the same place and have the same access to reaching in an equitable way our end goal, and whatever that is as individuals.
It's also only fair to note that while blacks have heroically fought for our rights, often against great odds, we haven't done it alone. A vast number of decent whites have also advanced the cause of racial equality. To cite one of countless examples, the U.S. Senate that passed the landmark Civil Rights Act in 1964 contained 98 whites and 2 men of color.
So I have a few things to say. One, no taxation without representation. There's 98 whites to 2 men of color.
And they were Asian.
And they were Asian. There were no black people in the Congress, in the Senate rather, in 1964. Not one. By any sort of understanding, there should have been a number greater than 0. If there was some sort of equality of opportunity, etc. So when the US speaks about taxation without representation, and we see something like this, doesn't it kind of draw a disconnect between the foundation of the country in 1776 and the myths that are purported and how they affected people in 1964? Can we not say that racism was a huge factor, that the chattel slavery and the inability to get any sort of access to proper voting through all of the methods that were used, the poll taxes, the voter ID laws, the Jim Crow stuff, that it prevented people from being able to vote a senator in? Probably. Most definitely. So that's one thing I want to say. The second thing I need to say is nobody's saying in any of this that white people are incapable of doing good things, that they're incapable of producing good results for people of color. There's plenty of times where they're patronizing doing it, and there's plenty of times where they're really, really good about it. So given all of that, I don't know why he feels the need to defend white people in this particular instance, as if they're somehow coming under attack, that they're just all evil slaveholders and whatever. We know that. Also, John Brown exists. He was a really big proponent of abolition, and actually took some really serious praxis in order to make sure slaves were freed, and trying to incite a slave revolt. So yeah, of course there's just good white people. Just look at John Brown. Why do I get the feeling Prager University would not promote John Brown?
The great black leaders of the past, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, Martin Luther King, never lost faith in America's promise that all people are created equal. None of them...
All of them fought tooth and nail in their own respective ways to earn that equality that was handed to white people, especially white men, from the moment of the Declaration of Independence, and likely beforehand. The fact that they had to fight tooth and nail for that, and fight against racism, is kind of the point of the project.
Believed that racism was America's defining characteristic. They were right.
You're going to tell me that Harriet Tubman, in her day and age, as she worked tirelessly in the Underground Railroad to bring people from the South all the way up through the north and into Canada, when she put her life on the line, that she would not have said, racism defines this country? Maybe she would not have used those specific words, but if you actually examine any of the understandings of at least her and MLK, they knew the evils of racism and how it defined the reality and lived experiences of people. They did wish for a better world and reality, and they fought like hell for it. But they shouldn't have had to. That's the point. That's literally the point.
Right. Shortly after the 1619 Project was published, a group of distinguished historians, almost all on the left, wrote a public letter condemning the work. They called it a displacement of historical understanding by ideology. They were right too. I'm Wilfred Riley, Associate Professor of Political Science at Kentucky State University for Prager University.
So, those leftist thinkers, this actually happened. And it's actually quite an interesting and complicated understanding. What I will go over is the New York Times actually, in response to this, posted the letter and has had a back and forth with a lot of historians about this thing. Some things have been corrected, some things have been pushed back by the New York Times, and the reasons were given and cited. But one thing that I wanted to note from the letter that gives it a lot more context, and this is the letter from the historians to the New York Times. We applaud all efforts to address the enduring centrality of slavery and racism to our history. Some of us have devoted our entire professional lives to those efforts, and all of us have worked hard to advance them. Raising profound, unsettling questions about slavery and the nation's past and present, as the 1619 Project does, is a praiseworthy and urgent public service. Nevertheless, we are dismayed at some of the factual errors in the project and the closed process behind it. So what they essentially had issues with is there were certain things they deemed to be factually incorrect, and that there were some things that should have been more open about the project and where it came from. And I am not going to pass a judgment on this particular statement because I don't know enough about the individual historians, and I don't know enough about things. But one of the criticisms about these particular historians is that they're all white historians that wrote this letter. And so I have to call into question, I guess on some level, whether or not they are not speaking from a mythological and privileged position, or if some of the things are just genuinely egregious. But there's debate, there's conversation to be had. And as you can see, the New York Times was not shying away from this. They posted the letter as it was. They gave a response. And there's a lot of back and forth. And they're not the only historians. There were a lot of historians who came out. A lot of people from different backgrounds spoke about this project. And it's been an ongoing conversation. And again, some things have been amended or fixed. One of the arguments, namely that the American Revolution was started by and for slavery, it kind of had language that implied that it was every colonist that had that at first. And so that was one of the types of criticism that was spoken about, and the author made that change and said some. And as I've shown in this video, that is actually accurate. There were some ties to Great Britain for slavery, and again, Great Britain preventing access to the West meant that there was conflict between Native Americans and the expansion of slavery westward that was being protected again by the British. So, in conclusion, I believe that the 1619 Project is much more represented by the thesis I stated that chattel slavery was a part of this country before it had a name, that it marked this nation, and the legacy of that has lasting effects throughout the history of the United States and into today. I believe that Prager University, again, has been disingenuous with most of its claims, and I hope that this brought into everybody's mind some of the issues that go into reframing the country's history. That it is not okay to just look at it from this very white, traditional, mythological perspective, and we need to be expanding that definition and including more voices and including more understandings. With that said, if you liked the video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and hit the bell for notifications. Follow me on Twitter and check out my new Discord in the description below. And my name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you enjoyed watching.